Hello listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing energy matters in an informal setting. In this week's pod, we'll discuss a piece of legislation that is causing some concern in Europe's electricity sector. The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, often called CBAM for short. It's a form of carbon border tax, designed to address carbon leakage, i.e. to prevent companies moving to jurisdictions with less strict emissions rules, and to keep the industrial sector in the EU competitive by charging a carbon levy at the borders of the 27-country zone. The law could drastically reduce cross-border flows between EU and non-EU countries and hit investment in renewable energy. Joining me, Richard Sverrisson, John-Paul Harreman, and Phil Hewitt of Montel Analytics. A warm welcome, gentlemen.
Hello. Thank you.
So Phil, if I can start by asking you, what is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM as it's often called? What is it, and why was it implemented?
So, as you said in your introduction, the issue we have is as Europe decarbonises, essentially it makes its industry more expensive, which encourages people to offshore production. So, by counting the cost of the carbon in anything you import, essentially having a tariff on the border, you then should at least stop industries leaving, or maybe even start repatriating them back to the European Union. It's an approach that's been taken by most modern economies. So, for example, the UK is also implementing a carbon border adjustment mechanism, but that's only on physical goods. They're not touching electricity. The difference here is that the European Union is actually including import of electricity in their carbon border adjustment mechanism.
Why was electricity included? I mean, I can understand why cement or iron and steel or these sectors, but electricity?
I don't know. You'd have to ask the Commission. But I assume it's a good, and it's an intangible good, but it's a product that can be moved across borders. So the EU decided to include it in its CBAM. As I said, the UK just thought it was just a bit too complicated and decided not to do it. And as we'll explore, I think, in the coming minutes, it is quite complicated.
Yeah, it is quite complicated and makes quite a lot of sense to have that kind of exemption for that good.
So, for example, there is no tariff on electricity. So when the UK left the single European market as part of the Brexit process, there is not actually tariffs charged on electricity. You still have to sign a customs declaration when you move electricity across an interconnector, but there is no tariff value on that interconnect on that electricity. So essentially, there is a border and there is a customs union that the UK is exporting into, but there is no tariff levied on electricity. But there will be a tariff levied on the carbon component of that electricity from the beginning of 2026, which is when the EU CBAM goes live.
And how will that work? I mean, how will it be calculated? Are there any details that we have, clarity over?
So reading the documentation that's coming out of the Commission, it's still kind of under consultation. So you could essentially kind of identify where your generation is coming from, that you're going to be moving across the border. The problem is that most electricity that's moved across borders, and most modern European electricity markets, the UK and the GB market included, majority of these trades are anonymous. You're trading in an anonymous auction, or you're trading it on an anonymous exchange. You don't know where the electricity comes from. Does the electricity come from a nuclear power station? Does it come from a wind farm? Does it come from a gas station? Does it come from a coal station? Who knows?
And can I add that we also don't know where the power is going to. So if you want to calculate the difference in carbon intensity of the exporting country and the importing country, since the trades are anonymous, the power might flow from the UK to Netherlands or to Belgium or to France, but the markets are coupled. So this power may go anywhere in the coupled market area. So the traceability of what are we comparing with what is very low.
Absolutely. I mean, that leads me to my next question, really, JP, and I say, which countries or regions will it affect the most? I mean, obviously, Phil's highlighting the UK not being part of the EU. There are other regions in the European Union, such as in Southeastern Europe, maybe even Eastern Europe, but it will also have a knock-on effect to the UK's neighbours.
Absolutely, yes. So the first country that comes to mind is Ireland, which is in the European Union, but only connected to the UK. So that's the first one, which will probably see the worst effects because it's very dependent on renewables, and sometimes it has a shortage of generation, which forces it to import from the UK. Which then gets subjected to CBAM. Of course, the other neighbours to the UK, although I have to admit I'm not completely sure what happens with Norway because it's not EU, but it is in the coupled markets. So that is a bit of an unclear one for me. And then indeed in Southeastern Europe we have a few non-EU countries, some of which are structural exporters of energy. And so we have countries like Bosnia and Serbia that import and export a lot of power in the region, also to EU countries. So they will also be affected. Yeah, and they are also in coupled markets to an extent, and therefore the traceability of your power flows is very low because I think they're not in core flow based, so it is it just becomes extremely complicated to label where power comes from and where it goes to. It's just one big copper plate in essence. So
exactly. I mean, we can't, they're all electrons, as well as, the trading being anonymous, but you can't actually trace a certain electron, or certainly that's the nature of electricity as such. But I'll come back to some of the details because I think they are extremely complex, also quite mind-boggling, and also the in terms of the unintended consequences are quite mind-boggling. But Phil, what's the timeline? I mean, I think it was passed, if I'm not mistaken, last year. We're now in a transition period. I mean, when does it actually take place?
So the mechanism goes live at the beginning of 2026. At the moment, you're right, we're in a transition phase. So people are having to fill in paperwork. So I interact with customers who are trading with the GB market. So they have to identify a customs broker who's set up to be able to provide these CBAM declarations. So, of course, all the customs brokers are all kind of running around going, they're not sure what they have to do. So at the moment, people are having to submit the declarations, and the declarations are submitted quarterly, and they have to be completed within a month at the end of the quarter. So they submit these declarations, but at the moment there's no value attached to. There's no money changing hands. So at the moment it's just a kind of information exercise. What will happen is when the system goes live in 2026, because it's going to be difficult to track exactly where the electricity has come from. I would have thought the majority are going to go onto a default arrangement. And this is the average carbon intensity for fossil fuel generation in the country, which is outside the European Union's internal electricity market. So that for the previous 5 years, but for 2 years before, so essentially from year 7 to year 2. Now, as countries like all over Europe are heavily decarbonising, it's quite a lagging indicator. So, and the second thing is the GB market is only ever going to really be exporting to Europe when power is cheaper than Europe. And when is power going to be cheaper than Europe? When they're using cheaper sources of electricity. And what are the cheapest sources of electricity? Renewables. Therefore, if you kind of look at the numbers that have been quoted in various reports, the carbon intensity number that's going to be used is going to be between 400, well, let's say around 400 grams per kilowatt hour, or 400 kilograms per ton, per megawatt hour. When GB is exporting, typically it's exporting because it's got too much wind or a lot of wind or a lot of solar. its actual carbon intensity is usually no more than 100 grams per kilowatt hour. So essentially, the GB market is paying 4 times the carbon the carbon cost than the actual real-time generation because of the default arrangements and because it's difficult to track and identify where the particular electron that you've picked up on the day-ahead exchange or the intraday market has come from.
So we're in a transition period at the moment. I sense a lot of work here for these custom brokers.
Yes. And there's also going to have to be some formal identification of who is going to be the official keeper of record of the carbon intensity of all of the country and of the European internal energy market. There's going to be plenty of debate around there. This story is going to run and run and run.
Absolutely. And if we're going back to 2017, then the UK was still burning coal then. So I think it seems, 2024, the situation or the electricity mix in 2024 is very different from what it was in 2017. Right?
Yes, there's only one coal station left, and that coal station will finish running at the end of this year. So coal exits the GB electricity market on the 1st of October. There will be no more coal burnt. But 7 years ago, we had 4 or 5 or even 6 coal-fired stations running, and we had a far more carbon-intensive generation mix. So, it doesn't quite seem fair.
So the UK seems to be very hard hit here. What kind of impact can you foresee on flows, Jean-Paul? You mentioned, the interconnectors to the Netherlands, to Belgium, France, and also Denmark, surely, and Norway's a bit of a special case here. But how will those flows be impacted?
Yeah, so there was an article published about the impacts of the CBAM on power flows for Energinet, the Danish TSO, where they basically said we will not be able to import power from UK anymore, or we will not import power from UK anymore because the price difference is too big. So, which basically defeats the purpose of having an interconnector in the first place. The purpose is it flows in 2 directions. You have the optionality to help each other out. If it only flows in one direction, it just cuts the revenues for the operator of the interconnector down very significantly, which I suppose they would have liked to have known at the time they decided to build the interconnector. It's just gone live. What is it, Phil? Half a year ago?
Yes, it went live on the 29th of December 2023. So literally the interconnector is shiny and brand new. It's been going for around 4 months.
And now it's being hit with this.
Yes. And now it's
potentially
going to be hit with CBAM, yes.
And so that's the impact on the flows. And the other cables will be hit pretty similar in a similar way.
Yes,
presumably.
Yes. Every country is facing this in its own peculiar ways. So in the Netherlands, for example, the grid is heavily congested. The BritNet cable has not been allowed to be used to relieve congestion for a while. It's just been reversed. So now people can use BritNet volumes again to relieve the grid situation in the Netherlands, which is dire, I would say. But if you have to reverse the flow from Netherlands, because we will be exporting to the UK, if you have to reverse the flow and then increase your costs by as much as the CBAM levy will be, it becomes very expensive to solve the congestion. And 1,000 megawatts of congestion relief is quite significant.
And that couldn't effectively just disappear then, JP?
It could disappear, but I don't think it will, because the problem is so severe that we will need all of the flexibility we can get in Netherlands. So what that will do is it will inflate congestion costs and thereby inflate grid fees. And grid fees are one of the major limitations for adding additional flexibility to the Dutch grid. So if you can see
So this is kind of it's snowballing out of control in a sense, in a way, in terms of increasing costs and doing the opposite of what is really needed in the country such as the Netherlands.
Correct. Yeah. So it's not just the UK that's being hit; it's also the Netherlands. And then I think in the UK, what you also see, and it might not be obvious from what we've discussed before, but I think there's also going to be an impact on renewable investments. So if you cannot export your excess renewables to Europe anymore because there's no price difference, or the CBAM causes the export prices to be higher than local prices in Europe. The only thing that's left is curtailing your renewables, and that kind of hits the renewable business case as well. So it's also hurting decarbonization, which is not the intention of CBAM, I would suppose.
No, I mean, it's quite the reverse. I mean, Phil, that's what I was going to ask you about, and the impact in the UK, which has seen a boom in offshore wind, in recent years. People still planning on building these turbines offshore mainly. What will be the impact on these kind of investments and the renewable sector generally in the UK?
Yeah, so if we go over the reasons again, we have an interconnector. We have a number of people trading on that interconnector using something called explicit auctions. Those traders will have to factor in the administrative load of now having to handle this CBAM process. So they're going to want a little bit more money for that. They're going to factor in the unknown CBAM cost because they don't know at that particular moment maybe what the carbon intensity will be on each side. So there's a potential risk there. So that increases the price. So we then flow less power from GB into those adjacent markets. So because we're flowing less power, it means that when the wind is blowing in GB, because we're building so much offshore wind, that power will have nowhere to go. So the price for power in GB will go down. And if that power drops below zero, all the newer wind farms are being built on contract for difference, which actually has a rule in it that if you have more than 6 hours of consecutive less than zero price electricity, the mechanism suspends for that asset, which means that a lot of these offshore wind farms at the moment have been built on the assumption that they can dump their excess power into Europe. The amount of excess power they're going to be able to dump into Europe is going to decrease dramatically because the price difference to justify the interconnector flowing between Europe and GB, or to flow from GB to Europe has to be bigger to justify it, which means that there will be a lot more negative pricing events in GB, which means that the CFD income for those offshore wind farms will go down, which is then an investment risk. So anybody wanting to go into an auction now has got a very complicated model to run to try and work out the impact of CBAM on their running hours, which means that they will require a higher CFD cost, which increases the cost of decarbonisation in GB.
As John Paul has said, just rather than actually aiding the decarbonisation process, it's going to make it much more difficult in certain jurisdictions.
Yeah.
But were these investors, were they aware of this when they made these investments?
I doubt it, and it takes a very long time to build an offshore wind farm. So typically it takes you between 5 and 10 years to get to a decision to actually maybe go and enter an auction, and then it's going to take you 5 years to build the plant. So there are wind farms that have planning, have got a contract now with the government, are on the 6-hour rule, which means that their negative price is more than 6 hours, they don't get paid, who are already in the process, already in the pipeline to be built, and now they're at risk from CBAM.
And what are you hearing from companies in GB? Are they aware of this, or is this going to come as a bit of a surprise?
I don't think everybody's quite aware of what the impact is going to be. If the interconnectors weren't aware and they have a foot in each camp, so to speak, then an offshore wind farm developer who is only interested in the GB market is going to be in for a bit of a shock. So I think a lot of offshore wind developers are going to start to think, we didn't see this coming.
And these are companies as well that operate on both sides of the interconnector often, aren't they, as well?
Yes, yes. So big investors like Ørsted and Statoil, Equinor.
Equinor, yeah. Absolutely. But I mean, TSOs have been aware, haven't they? Or you mentioned Energinet, the Danish TSO. What about Tenet or other continental TSOs? Are they also aware of the potential consequences of this measure?
I don't think we've seen any comments from other TSOs so far, but yeah, this is slowly sinking in. I think we're at the start of a very turbulent period, and I think there will be a very strong lobby to try and get an exemption for electricity because it's just very difficult. So you can't track the origin, you can't track the destination. Even if you would make an abstraction and say, okay, so we have a net import or a net export from a certain country, what would you define as export? So let's take an example. Netherlands is exporting 1,000 megawatts into UK. And then at some point, one of the TSOs decides, actually, we can't really support this. We need the power on our side of the interconnector to balance the grid, or something else is happening. And they stop the flow, which means zero flow. But actually, the initial situation was 1,000 megawatts export into the UK. Is this now UK actually exporting that 1,000 that was initially imported, or is it bringing the exports exactly to zero? What is it? Because the one position was done on a day ahead market, and then intraday there's another trade being done to reverse it. And then you also have, for example, days where administratively Netherlands is exporting 1,200 megawatts into UK, and someone is administratively exporting 200 megawatts from the UK into the Netherlands. How does that work? I don't think it's completely specified. It is not. It's not like two crates of beer go across the border. They come from a high carbon country, so we put a tax on it. It's just something you can't see. You don't know how much it is. You don't know where it comes from. You don't know where it's going. How are you going to tax it?
Exactly. Yeah. No. I mean, it makes it highly consistent. But also, Phil, when we were talking earlier about this, you mentioned, if it's a very cold day in France, and France is very reliant then on the UK for imports if there is some wind, in these kind of situations, it also gets quite complicated, doesn't it?
It does. So France has got plenty of generation most of the time, but their domestic demand is very temperature sensitive. So on a very cold day, France doesn't have enough generation. So it will then essentially cache the chips that it's been sending lots of generation to GB all the way through the summer. And it's saying, now, guys, I need you to send some back. And this puts the GB market under stress because Britain is now going to return the favour and export back into France. So, but now that cost of that import back into France is going to be significantly more than it would have been because you've got the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So essentially, France has been dumping cheap power without any taxation into GB, and now GB is going to be sending the power back to France, but it's going to be heavily taxed with the CBAM. So the people who are paying at the end will be French consumers because they'll be buying expensive British power inflated by taxes because of the CBAM. So it doesn't quite make sense to me. And one of the kind of underlying and kind of policy, if you're trying to create a policy where you are trying to stop importing goods from countries that are essentially taking advantage of Europe's desire to decarbonise because climate change is a real threat, And you have another country which is deciding to not decarbonise and take advantage by building factories and transferring those jobs from Europe to that country, which is the reason why you have a CBAM. But then if you actually look at what GB is a trailblazer in decarbonisation. It's kind of a petri dish. It's fully aligned with the European Union. It's signed in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the commitment to zero carbon. If anything, it's trying to decarbonise faster than the European Union, and yet it's being punished.
Do you think it's a kind of a punitive measure then?
I don't know whether it's a punitive measure. I think it's just badly thought through. I think it's badly thought through because surely ultimately you use taxation to drive behaviour, and if the behaviour is fully aligned with your behaviour, why do you need to tax it? It doesn't really seem sensible for me. Is it an issue of fairness? I think ultimately, as Jean-Paul described the situation with the Netherlands, and I've just described the situation with France, you're actually going to be piling costs onto European consumers for no real benefit, because you're not GB can't. Well, actually, and if anything, the result is that GB will decarbonise slower.
So, yeah, you're increasing costs and hampering the road to decarbonisation. It makes very little sense. And also, potentially, as you mentioned, Jean-Paul, in the earlier, that you're deterring investments as well into green energy, because the countries that really need to change their energy mix to sort of cleaner, greener version. You mentioned Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. I mean, surely these countries, they're going to think twice about investing renewables or into wind.
Yes, I would think so. I mean, if your renewable investments are not, or your new renewable generation is not taken into account for CBAM, it's just going to reduce the revenue for your renewables, because the amount of times you can export your excess renewables, or it will just decrease. So why would you do it just out of idealism? But to be honest, I don't think the poorer half of the countries in Europe should be on that side of the coin. I think if anything, they should be helped.
Absolutely. I mean, what happens next, do you think, Phil? Do you expect to see a lot of lobbying and a lot of pressure put on the Commission to potentially exempt electricity or exempt the UK? Do you think these are sort of likely paths going forward?
I think that might happen. I think that all the different TSOs. So majority of the time, when you build an interconnector, it's built by a TSO because they have access to cheaper finance. And they're experienced in building cables. So the transmission system operators will be lobbying extensively, I would have thought, to remove the CBAM from electricity, and it kind of makes sense, as I think as we've kind of rehearsed in this podcast, and it's kind of a function of Brexit, of course, as a lot of these things are, and the country that always gets hammered by Brexit is Ireland. So if we look at the single electricity market of Ireland, at the moment, it's a market which is actually one of the few markets in Europe that's actually growing demand year on year because of the build out of data centres, because of its permissive tax regime and historical links with the US. So Irish demand is growing, and Ireland at the moment is dependent on GB for when the wind doesn't blow. The capacity mechanism in Ireland will build new generation, but that's 3 years ahead. So Ireland is potentially going to be exposed to extremely high prices when it needs emergency power from Britain over the interconnectors because of CBAM. So again, Irish consumers, who are already paying some of the highest electricity prices in Europe, will be paying even higher electricity prices.
Doesn't exactly make sense, but to put it mildly, but Jean-Paul, if I can sort of close by asking you, do you expect it to be implemented in 2026 as it stands today, the legislation?
That's an interesting question. I would go back and look at other implementations of European legislation. So, most recent example is European harmonization of balancing markets, which is constantly being delayed. We've seen countries delaying by 3 years, by 5 years, by several months, conditionally acceding to the process if certain changes are made. It would not surprise me if CBAM would go a similar route. And yeah, as you said, I would expect extensive lobbying, not just from TSOs, but I would, as the realization sinks in that this is going to affect more people than anyone initially thought, I would expect more pressure coming from different ranges of the electricity market.
I mean, I'm sure this is a subject matter that you guys will be watching very closely, and us at Montel News, we will certainly be reporting all the ebbs and flows of where we take us, where the path goes forward. So, John Paul and Phil, thank you very much for being guests on the Montel Weekly podcast.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.